A billionaire's daughter had been in a coma for days. The doctors lost hope. World-class specialists flew in from different countries and failed. Then out of nowhere, a homeless boy walked into the hospital and softly said 5 unbelievable words. "I can wake her up." At first, the billionaire laughed. But what happened next shocked everyone. This is not just a story. It's a miracle you won't forget. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Stories like this remind us that hope can come from the most unexpected places, and your support helps us share more moments that restore faith in humanity. The clock on the sterile white wall of Massachusetts General Hospital clicked over to 2:47 p.m. The place felt cold, and the air in room 512 was thick with that sharp hospital smell, antiseptic and bleach. It was the kind of smell that made it hard to breathe. The machines in the room were humming, but it wasn't the sound of an emergency. It was just a low, steady noise, the sound of a life being held prisoner. The worst part was the heart monitor. It just kept beeping, beep, beep, slow and steady, which felt like a cruel joke to her father, whose own heart was hammering against his ribs. In the middle of that big, high-tech bed, 8-year-old Sophie Harrington looked tiny. She was just a small shape under a light blue blanket. Her blonde hair was spread out on the pillow, and her eyes were squeezed shut. Tubes were everywhere, wrapped around her small body. She hadn't moved or made a sound in 9 days. 9 endless days. It was crazy how fast it happened. 1 minute she was at the breakfast table, laughing at her father's terrible pancake flip. The next, she was reaching for her backpack, and she just collapsed. They had brought in the best doctors, flown in from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, even specialists from Europe. These were supposed to be the top experts, the best of the best. After all their tests, they finally gave it a scary name, acute neurological shutdown. It was really just a fancy way of saying they had no idea what was wrong. They just used long, confusing medical words that sounded like expensive guesses. "She might wake up," one of the specialists had said with a heavy sigh. "She might not," Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the hospital's chief neurologist, added. She said it like she was reading the weather forecast. Her father, Richard Harrington, sat in the chair right next to her. This was a man who built empires. He was a tech billionaire, founder of Harrington Technologies. His company had revolutionized artificial intelligence and made him one of the 50 richest men in America. His hands were smooth but strong, hands that knew how to sign billion-dollar contracts and shake hands with presidents. But now, as he held Sophie's small, limp hand, they felt completely and totally useless. All his success, all his money, all the innovations he'd created, it was all garbage. It meant nothing when he couldn't get his little girl to open her eyes. The nurses would walk by and whisper that he was devoted. Dr. Morrison probably just thought he was desperate. Richard didn't care what any of them called it. Hope wasn't just fading. It felt like it was being ripped away, piece by piece. By that 9th day, Richard could hear the doctors whispering in the hallway. They were using words like hospital protocol, insurance limitations, and long-term care facilities. They weren't talking about curing her anymore. They were talking about managing her decline. That's when Dr. Morrison herself strode into the room, followed by 2 serious-looking residents. Dr. Morrison wasn't just the chief neurologist. She was a legend, a woman whose entire reputation was built on cutting-edge neuroscience and the most advanced medical technology money could buy. Her research had been published in every major journal. She'd spoken at conferences around the world. When she looked at Sophie, she didn't see a tragedy. She saw a puzzle that was making her look bad. "Mr. Harrington," Dr. Morrison began, smoothing out her perfectly pressed white coat. "We've done the full neurological mapping. We've used the AI-powered diagnostics, the same system your company helped develop. We've done everything the protocols say to do." She talked about medicine the same way Richard talked about code, like it was a science that could never be wrong. She looked at Sophie like she was a broken circuit board. Richard, worn down and desperate, asked the only question that mattered. "Will it bring her back?" Dr. Morrison's lips tightened. "Mr. Harrington, with enough data input and computational analysis, we can optimize her neural pathways. We'll essentially reboot her consciousness." That phrase, "reboot her consciousness," hung in the air like poison. Richard's face, usually so composed and controlled, hardened. He stood up very, very slowly and gently placed Sophie's hand back on the blanket. "She's not a computer," he said, his voice dangerously low. "She's a little girl." Dr. Morrison waved her hand dismissively. "Emotion clouds judgment, Mr. Harrington. Science wins. That's why you built your fortune on it." But Dr. Morrison's science failed. She brought in more machines with more blinking lights, more AI algorithms, more experimental treatments. They even tried something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, using powerful magnets to shock Sophie's brain into responding. Nothing worked. She remained silent, unmoving. One by one, the expensive specialists got on their planes and flew home. All they left behind were gigantic bills and the silent beeping monitors. By the end of the second week, Dr. Morrison stopped visiting the room entirely. She just sent her interns. But Richard stayed. He sat there and read her favorite books out loud, Harry Potter, Charlotte's Web, Where the Wild Things Are. He played her favorite songs on his phone, Taylor Swift, Disney soundtracks, the lullabies her mother used to sing. He even told her about the stars, a passion they had always shared, pointing to the window as if she could see them through her closed eyelids. Across the city, in a rundown shelter in Roxbury, a boy named Tyler Johnson sat on a thin mattress, polishing an old harmonica his grandmother had given him before she died. He couldn't have been more than 10, and he hadn't been to school in over a year. His grandmother, Mama Grace, had been a folk healer in their North Carolina community before they moved north. She had taught Tyler everything, the power of presence, the importance of truth, and how to know when a person's spirit had simply forgotten the way home. The reason Tyler wasn't in school was simple and heartbreaking. Mama Grace couldn't afford the fees. And after she passed 6 months ago, Tyler had been on his own, moving between shelters, trying to survive. "Tyler, baby," Mama Grace used to say, her voice warm as honey. "Your gift isn't in what you can fix with your hands. It's in what you can reach with your heart. But a child must also walk where other children walk. You must go back to school." "How, Grandma?" Tyler had asked, looking up with those deep, clear eyes that looked like they had seen far too much for his age. "The fees are higher than the buildings downtown." Mama Grace had smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. "Patience, baby. The universe sends opportunities when the need is greatest. Our healing is real, Tyler. But the world only accepts what it can touch with money." The next day, Tyler was at a soup kitchen on Tremont Street when he overheard 2 volunteers talking, their voices low but urgent. He was halfway through his meal, plastic spoon frozen in midair, when he heard the name. "Did you hear about the Harrington girl?" one woman said, her face full of concern. "Richard Harrington's daughter. She's been in a coma for over a week now at Mass General." "The billionaire?" the other volunteer gasped. "The tech guy. I heard they've flown in doctors from everywhere. If all that money can't save her. They're saying it's like her soul just left," the first woman continued, shaking her head. "No medical explanation. Nothing the machines can detect. It's like she's there, but she's not there. You know what I mean?" Tyler froze. Sophie Harrington. A girl whose spirit had wandered too far from home. This was exactly what Mama Grace had taught him about. Not a medical problem, but a spiritual one. He suddenly felt the rough wooden bench beneath him, heard Mama Grace's voice in his mind clear as day. "When you find someone lost in the darkness, Tyler, you light the way home. Not with science. With love." This wasn't just gossip. This was the opportunity Mama Grace had spoken about. If he could help the daughter of the most powerful man in the city using the old way, maybe they would help him get back to school. Maybe he could prove that Mama Grace's life's work was real. Maybe he could protect what she'd taught him from being forgotten. He quickly finished his meal, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He walked back to the shelter, grabbed the harmonica from under his thin pillow, and made his decision. That night, at 11:47 p.m., Tyler walked through the cold Boston streets to Massachusetts General Hospital. He was still wearing his oversized donated jacket, his sneakers worn through at the toes. He carried only his grandmother's harmonica and a feeling of complete certainty. When he reached the ICU floor, a night nurse looked up from her station, startled. "Son, visiting hours are over," she said, frowning. "How did you even get up here?" "I need to see Sophie Harrington," Tyler said quietly but firmly. "I can help her." The nurse's face softened with pity. "Sweetheart, I don't think." "Please," Tyler interrupted, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pause. "Just tell her father I'm here. Tell him I know how to bring her back." Something in the boy's voice, the certainty, the calmness, the impossible wisdom, made the nurse hesitate. Against all protocol, against every rule she'd ever followed, she walked down the hall to room 512 and tapped on the window. Richard looked up, his eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. "Mr. Harrington," she whispered through the door. There's a boy here. He says he can wake Sophie up." Richard stepped out into the hallway, confusion and exhaustion written across his face. There, sitting all alone on the cold hospital bench, was a homeless boy who couldn't have been older than 10. He wore clothes that didn't fit, and his face, though smudged with the dirt of the streets, was dominated by eyes that were deep, clear, and impossibly wise. Tyler stood up as Richard approached. He nodded respectfully, his eyes locked on the exhausted, powerful man. "Are you Sophie's father?" Tyler asked. "Yes," Richard said hesitantly. "Who are you?" The boy didn't answer the question. Instead, he said the 5 words that instantly shattered the sterile silence of the hospital. "I can wake her up." Richard blinked, completely stunned. What did you say?" "I know how to wake her up," Tyler repeated. The words weren't loud or arrogant. They were just certain. Richard, sleep-deprived and emotionally devastated, let out a bitter laugh. "You're just a kid. Listen, I appreciate whatever this is, but the best doctors in the world couldn't help her. Specialists from Europe couldn't help her. I don't think." "She's not lost," Tyler said softly, interrupting him. "She's listening from far away, but she doesn't know if it's safe to come back." Richard's mouth went dry. This boy, this homeless child with worn-through shoes, was speaking a language Richard hadn't heard in years. The language of faith, of things that couldn't be measured or coded. The language his wife used to speak before she died. Tyler stepped forward, meeting the billionaire's weary eyes. "She needs something the hospital doesn't have." "What?" Richard whispered, clutching at the last tiny thread of hope he had. "She needs your pain, your truth, the words you've hidden behind all your strength." Richard was stunned into silence. Who was this boy? How could he possibly know? Tyler ignored the questions burning in Richard's eyes. "Can I sit with her?" Every rational, successful, logical instinct Richard had screamed, "No, this is insane." But the ancient, aching part of him, the part that was just a father watching his daughter slip away, found himself nodding. "All right," he whispered, defeated yet strangely hopeful. The tension in the hallway was so thick you could barely breathe. The barefoot boy from the streets was about to confront the silence that the city's most expensive medicine couldn't break. But to understand how Tyler Johnson came to be standing in that hospital hallway at nearly midnight, making an impossible promise to one of the richest men in America, you have to go back. Back to where his story really began, in a place that couldn't have been more different from the gleaming towers of Massachusetts General Hospital. 3 weeks earlier, Tyler had been sitting in a rundown shelter in Roxbury, on a thin mattress that smelled like disinfectant and old sweat. The place was always cold, even in the middle of summer. The walls were cracked and painted a sad shade of yellow that had probably been white once. Around him, other homeless people shuffled through their routines, some mentally ill, some just unlucky, all of them forgotten by the world outside. Tyler sat cross-legged on his mattress, carefully polishing an old harmonica with the edge of his too-big t-shirt. It was the only thing of value he owned. Not because it was expensive. It wasn't. The thing was probably worth $5 at a pawn shop. But it had been his grandmother's, and Mama Grace had pressed it into his hands the day before she died. "This belonged to my daddy," she'd whispered, her voice weak but warm. "And now it's yours, baby. When you feel lost, you play it. When you feel scared, you play it. And when you find someone else who's lost and scared, you play it for them too." That had been 6 months ago. 6 months of Tyler moving from shelter to shelter, sleeping on benches when the weather was warm enough, standing in line at soup kitchens, watching the world move around him like he was invisible. He hadn't been to school in over a year. Not since Mama Grace got too sick to work and the bills started piling up. Mama Grace had been special. Everyone in their neighborhood back in North Carolina knew it. She was a folk healer, someone people came to when the doctors couldn't help or when the medicine cost too much. She knew which plants could bring down a fever, which prayers could calm a troubled mind, and most importantly, how to recognize when someone's body was fine but their spirit had simply forgotten the way home. "Tyler, baby," she used to say, sitting on their porch in the evening heat, teaching him everything she knew. "Your gift isn't in what you can fix with your hands. It's in what you can reach with your heart." Some people, they get lost inside themselves. They're scared or hurting so bad that their spirit just wanders off. And all the doctors in the world with all their fancy machines can't call a spirit back. Only love can do that. Only truth. Tyler had learned everything from her. The power of presence, just being there when someone needed you. The importance of truth, speaking what was real, even when it hurt. And how to listen not just with your ears, but with something deeper. How to feel when someone was crying out from a place too far away for sound to reach. After Mama Grace died, Tyler had nowhere to go. No other family. No money. He'd tried to stay in their little apartment, but the landlord kicked him out when he couldn't pay rent. That's when he'd ended up on the streets, moving north to Boston, where he'd heard there were more shelters, more help. But help was hard to find when you were a homeless black kid with no parents and no paperwork. The system was supposed to catch you, but Tyler had learned to slip through the cracks. It was easier than being sent to some foster home where they'd try to make him forget everything Mama Grace had taught him. So he survived. He stood in line for meals. He slept where he could. And every night, he'd take out that harmonica and play the songs Mama Grace had taught him, letting the notes carry his prayers up into the darkness. The harmonica was the only thing that made him feel less alone. It was on one of those hungry afternoons that everything changed. Tyler was at the soup kitchen on Tremont Street, a place run by a church that asked no questions and turned no one away. He was sitting at a long table, eating watery vegetable soup and stale bread, when he heard two volunteers talking behind the serving counter. "Did you hear about the Harrington girl?" one woman said, her voice low but urgent. She was middle-aged, wearing a church volunteer t-shirt. "Richard Harrington's daughter. She's been in a coma for over a week now at Mass General." Tyler's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "The billionaire?" the other volunteer gasped, nearly dropping the ladle she was holding. "The tech guy. I heard they've flown in doctors from everywhere. If all that money can't save her." "That's what I'm saying," the first woman continued, shaking her head. "They're saying it's like her soul just left. No medical explanation. Nothing the machines can detect. It's like she's there, but she's not there. You know what I mean? Her body's alive, but there's nobody home." Tyler froze completely. His plastic spoon clattered back into his bowl. Sophie Harrington. A little girl whose spirit had wandered too far from home. This was exactly what Mama Grace had taught him about. Not a medical problem that needed surgery or pills. A spiritual one that needed something else entirely. He felt the worn harmonica in his jacket pocket, its weight suddenly heavy with meaning. And then, clear as day, he heard Mama Grace's voice in his mind. Not a memory, but something stronger, something real. "When you find someone lost in the darkness, Tyler, you light the way home. Not with science. With love." His heart started pounding. This wasn't just gossip. This was why. This was what Mama Grace had been preparing him for. If he could help the daughter of the most powerful man in the city using the old way, Mama Grace's way, maybe it would mean something. Maybe it would prove that what she'd taught him wasn't just superstition. Maybe someone would finally listen. Tyler barely tasted the rest of his soup. His mind was racing, planning. He'd have to go to the hospital. Tonight. He'd have to find a way to get to her, to get past the security and the doctors, and all the people who'd take one look at a homeless kid and send him away. But Mama Grace had always said, "When the universe calls you to do something, baby, it'll open the doors you need." That night, Tyler lay on his thin mattress in the shelter waiting. Around him, other people snored and muttered in their sleep. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, never quite turning off. At 11:30 p.m., when the night attendant was distracted with some drunk man arguing at the front desk, Tyler slipped out through the side door. The Boston streets were cold and empty. Tyler walked quickly, his oversized donated jacket pulled tight around him. His sneakers, worn through at the toes, made soft slapping sounds on the pavement. He passed through wealthy neighborhoods where every house was lit up like a palace, where cars that cost more than Mama Grace had earned in her entire life sat in driveways. The contrast was staggering. Just hours ago, he'd been eating stale bread at a soup kitchen. Now he was walking past homes with swimming pools and security cameras. This was the world Sophie Harrington came from. A world of comfort and safety and every advantage money could buy. And none of it had been able to save her. Tyler kept walking, the harmonica bouncing in his pocket with each step. He didn't have a plan exactly. But he had certainty, that bone-deep knowing that Mama Grace used to talk about. The kind of certainty that doesn't come from your head, but from somewhere much deeper. When Massachusetts General Hospital finally came into view, all glass and steel and imposing authority, Tyler didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the entrance, through the automatic doors, past the security desk while the guard was checking someone's ID. He followed the signs to the ICU, took the elevator up, and stepped onto the floor where the dying were kept alive by machines. That's when the nurse had looked up, startled to see a homeless boy standing there at nearly midnight. And that's when Tyler had said the words that would change everything. "I need to see Sophie Harrington. I can help her." He wasn't entirely sure how he was going to help, but Mama Grace had taught him to trust the knowing. And right now, every cell in his body knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The ICU floor at night was a different world. The fluorescent lights were dimmed to a soft glow, and the air felt heavier somehow, thick with the weight of all the families holding vigil in those rooms. The only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the quiet squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum. Nurse Jennifer Martinez had been working the night shift for 5 years, and she thought she'd seen everything. But when she looked up from her station and saw a homeless boy standing there, barefoot, clothes too big, face smudged with street dirt, she nearly jumped out of her chair. "Son, visiting hours are over," she said, her voice sharp with surprise. "How did you even get up here?" The boy looked at her with eyes that stopped her cold. They were dark and deep, the kind of eyes that seemed to carry something ancient in them. Something that didn't belong in a 10-year-old's face. "I need to see Sophie Harrington," Tyler said quietly but firmly. "I can help her." Jennifer's face softened immediately. Oh, this poor child. He probably saw something on the news, got some idea in his head. "Sweetheart, I don't think." "Please," Tyler interrupted, and something in his voice made Jennifer pause. It wasn't pleading. It was certain. "Just tell her father I'm here. Tell him I know how to bring her back." Jennifer opened her mouth to refuse, to call security, to do what protocol demanded. But she couldn't. There was something in the way this boy stood there, calm, patient, impossibly sure, that made the words die in her throat. His eyes held hers, and for a moment, she felt like she was looking at someone much, much older than 10. Against every rule she'd ever followed, against her better judgment, Jennifer found herself walking down the hall to room 512. She tapped gently on the window. Richard Harrington looked up, and Jennifer's heart broke a little at the sight of him. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, his expensive suit wrinkled from days of wearing it. His normally perfect hair was a mess. He looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 9 days. "Mr. Harrington," Jennifer whispered through the door, still not quite believing what she was about to say. There's a boy here. He says he can wake Sophie up." Richard's face went blank for a moment, like his brain couldn't process the words. Then he stood slowly and walked out into the hallway, moving like a man in a dream. Tyler was sitting on the cold hospital bench, his too-big jacket wrapped around him like armor. Up close, the contrast was staggering. Richard Harrington in his $1,000 suit and Italian leather shoes, even rumpled. Tyler Johnson in donated clothes and sneakers held together with duct tape. A white billionaire who'd built an empire on logic and data. A black homeless boy who carried nothing but his grandmother's harmonica and an impossible promise. But it was Tyler's eyes that Richard couldn't stop looking at. They were deep and clear and impossibly wise, like they'd seen things that shouldn't be visible to a child. Tyler stood up as Richard approached. He nodded respectfully, but there was no fear in his posture. No hesitation. "Are you Sophie's father?" Tyler asked. "Yes," Richard said, his voice hoarse from days of crying and praying and reading stories to an unresponsive child. "Who are you?" The boy didn't answer the question. Instead, He said 5 words that instantly shattered the sterile silence of the hospital. "I can wake her up." Richard blinked, stunned. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, impossible and clear. What did you say?" "I know how to wake her up," Tyler repeated. His voice wasn't loud or arrogant. It wasn't the voice of a child making wild claims. It was just certain, like he was stating a simple fact, like saying the sky was blue. Richard let out a bitter laugh that came from somewhere deep and broken inside him. "You're just a kid. Listen, I appreciate whatever this is, but the best doctors in the world couldn't help her. Specialists from Johns Hopkins, from Europe. They all tried. I don't think." "She's not lost," Tyler said softly, interrupting him. "She's listening from far away, but she doesn't know if it's safe to come back." Richard's mouth went dry. The words hit him like a physical blow. This boy, this homeless child with worn-through shoes and dirt under his fingernails, was speaking a language Richard hadn't heard in years. The language of faith, of spirit, of things that couldn't be measured by machines or explained by algorithms. It was the language his wife, Sarah, used to speak when she'd tuck Sophie in at night and whisper prayers over her. The language Richard had dismissed as superstition when he was building his fortune on ones and zeros, on cold, hard data. The language he'd forgotten even existed until this moment. "How?" Richard started, then stopped. His brilliant mind, trained to analyze and compute, couldn't make sense of this. "How could you possibly know that?" Tyler stepped forward, and despite being half Richard's size, there was something in his presence that felt bigger than the space he occupied. "She needs something the hospital doesn't have." "What?" Richard whispered, clutching at the last tiny thread of hope he had, even though every logical part of him was screaming that this was insane. Tyler's eyes never left Richard's face. "She needs your pain, your truth, the words you've hidden behind all your strength." Richard felt like he'd been punched in the chest. How could this boy know? How could he possibly know about the guilt, the regret, the words Richard had been too busy or too proud or too scared to say? He stood there, frozen, as every rational, successful, logical instinct he'd ever developed screamed at him. "No, this is insane. This is a homeless kid making wild claims. Call security. Get him out of here. Dr. Morrison will have you removed from Sophie's bedside if she finds out about this. You'll lose everything." But then there was the other voice, quieter but deeper. The voice of the ancient, aching part of him that wasn't a billionaire or a tech genius or a rational man of science. The part that was just a father watching his daughter slip away while machines beeped and expensive doctors shrugged their shoulders. That voice said, "What if he's right? What if you've been looking in all the wrong places?" Tyler watched him struggle, patient and still. Then he asked a simple question. "Can I sit with her?" Jennifer, who'd been watching from her station, audibly gasped. This was beyond protocol. This was potentially dangerous. This was, "All right," Richard whispered. The word came out before he could stop it. Before logic could overrule desperation. Before fear could silence hope. Tyler nodded once, like he'd expected nothing less. Jennifer's eyes went wide with shock, but she didn't move. Couldn't move. The tension in that hallway was so thick you could barely breathe. Something was happening here. Something that had nothing to do with medicine or science or any protocol she'd ever learned. The barefoot boy from the streets was about to confront the silence that the city's most expensive medicine couldn't break. And somewhere in room 512, machines continued their steady beeping, keeping a little girl's body alive while her spirit wandered in darkness, waiting for someone to call her home. Tyler walked into room 512, his bare feet making no sound at all on the polished hospital floor. The moment he crossed the threshold, the life support machines seemed to hum louder, their electronic symphony rising in pitch as if protesting his presence. Richard followed close behind, his chest tight, watching this dusty boy from the streets step into the sterile white world of cutting-edge medicine. The contrast was jarring. Everything in this room cost money, serious money. The bed alone probably cost more than Tyler had seen in his entire life. The monitors, the 4 stands, the specialized equipment that beeped and hummed and kept Sophie's body functioning. It was a temple of technology, of human achievement, of everything money could buy. And it had all failed. Tyler walked straight to Sophie's bed. He didn't glance at the blinking monitors showing her vitals. He didn't look at the tubes running into her small arms or the ventilator breathing for her. He only looked at her face, pale and still, framed by blonde hair spread across the pillow like a halo. He carried nothing. No medical equipment. No clipboard. No stethoscope. Just his presence and his certainty. Richard stood frozen near the door, watching. Part of him still couldn't believe he'd allowed this. Dr. Morrison would have him declared unfit if she found out. The hospital board would remove him from Sophie's care. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. Tyler reached out slowly and placed his small hand lightly on Sophie's forehead. His dark skin stood out against her pale face, his fingers gentle as if he were touching something sacred. His eyes closed, and his lips began to move. Richard strained to hear words, a prayer, maybe, or some kind of chant. But there were no words. Just a low humming sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in Tyler's chest. It was almost musical, like a river flowing over old stones, like wind through trees, like something ancient and wordless that existed before language. The sound filled the room, soft but persistent. And somehow, impossibly, the air began to shift. The sharp antiseptic smell that had dominated the space for 9 days seemed to fade, replaced by something warmer. Something that felt less like a hospital and more like home. Jennifer stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth, watching something she couldn't explain and knew she'd never forget. After what felt like both seconds and hours, Tyler opened his eyes and turned to Richard. When he spoke, his voice was shockingly firm for a child. Not bossy or demanding, but carrying an authority that made grown men listen. "Now you," he said. Richard blinked. "What?" "She knows you're here," Tyler said, his eyes boring into Richard's. "But she needs to know why you're still here." The words hit Richard like a sledgehammer. "Why are you still here?" It seemed like a simple question, but it cut right through every defense he'd built, every wall he'd constructed around his heart since Sarah died. I don't understand," Richard stammered. Tyler's gaze never wavered. "You've built your whole life on code and circuits, Mr. Harrington. Burying feelings, hiding pain, being strong." His voice softened. "But she doesn't need your strength right now. She needs your truth." Richard stared at his daughter, and suddenly all the armor he'd worn for so long felt like it was crushing him. This boy was demanding he dig up everything he'd buried. All the guilt, all the regret, all the words he'd been too busy or too proud or too scared to say. His lips began to tremble. His hands shook. And then, like a dam breaking, the words just spilled out, raw and painful and completely honest. "I wasn't there, baby," he whispered, tears instantly flooding his eyes. "I was at the office that morning. I was on a conference call about some algorithm that doesn't matter. I missed breakfast. I missed your smile." His voice cracked, the sound of a man breaking into pieces. "I should have seen something was wrong. I should have noticed you weren't feeling well. I should have been home earlier. I should have." The tears were flowing freely now, dropping onto Sophie's blue blanket, darkening the fabric. Richard grabbed her limp hand, his whole body shaking with grief he'd held back for so long. "I should have held you longer that morning," he choked out. "I should have told you how proud I was, how much I loved you, how you were more important than any company, any invention, any amount of money. I should have." He couldn't finish. He just sobbed, his forehead pressed against her small hand, all his carefully constructed control shattered completely. The air in the room felt thick enough to choke on, heavy with emotion and truth and things too big for words. And then something impossible happened. The heart monitor, that steady, monotonous beep that had driven Richard slowly insane for 9 days, blipped. Just slightly. Just enough to be noticeable. The rhythm quickened, just for a moment. Jennifer gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Did you see that?" Tyler's face remained calm, peaceful even. "I did," he said simply, pulling his hand away from Sophie's forehead. "She's listening." The monitor settled back to its steady rhythm, but Richard was staring at it like it held the secrets of the universe. Something had happened. Something real. Something the machines had registered. For Richard Harrington, the entire world had just shifted on its axis. Tyler picked up his worn jacket from where he'd set it on a chair. He headed toward the door, moving with that same quiet certainty. "Wait!" Richard scrambled to his feet, nearly tripping over his own expensive shoes. What's your name? Who are you? Tyler paused at the doorway, just a silhouette against the dim hallway lights. They call me Tyler, he said. Then, after a beat, I'll be back tomorrow. And with that, he walked out into the hallway, silent and barefoot, disappearing into the hospital gloom like he'd never been there at all. Richard turned back to the bed, his heart pounding, his face wet with tears. And then he saw it, Sophie's fingers. They twitched. Just once. Just slightly. But they moved. The first voluntary movement in 9 days. The machines around her began to blink with a slightly different pattern. Not the rhythm of routine. Not the rhythm of mechanical maintenance. But something new. Something that felt almost like hope. Richard sank back into his chair, still holding Sophie's hand, and for the first time since she'd collapsed, he felt something other than helpless despair. Something profound had shifted in this room. That boy, Tyler, had touched something that science couldn't reach, couldn't measure, couldn't explain. He thought of Sarah, his late wife, and the stories she used to tell Sophie at bedtime. Stories about angels and miracles and faith. The spiritual life Richard had dismissed and abandoned in his pursuit of algorithms and profits. Maybe he thought, maybe he'd been looking in all the wrong places. Outside the room, Jennifer stood at her station, staring at the security monitor that should have shown Tyler walking down the hallway. But the hallway was empty. The boy had vanished like smoke. Dawn came slowly to Boston, painting the skyline in streaks of purple and orange. The light crept through the window of room 512, casting long shadows across the floor. Richard Harrington hadn't moved from his chair. His back was stiff, his eyes felt like sandpaper, but he was still staring at Sophie. Still watching. Still hoping. Around 3 a.m., he'd seen it again, another tiny twitch of her fingers. Just a whisper of life. The kind of thing only a sleepless father who hadn't blinked in hours could possibly notice. The day nurse, a different woman than Jennifer, older and more businesslike, came rolling her cart in at 7 a.m. She checked her tablet, frowned, and glanced at Richard. "No visitor was signed in last night, Mr. Harrington," she said, her tone suggesting she thought he might be losing his grip on reality. "I checked the security footage myself. There was no child." She looked at him with something between pity and concern. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming? You're exhausted. Maybe you should go home, get some real sleep." Richard didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just looked at Sophie, at her fingers that had moved, at the monitor that had spiked. He knew Tyler was real. He knew what had happened in this room. The air had changed when that boy touched Sophie's forehead. Something had shifted, something science couldn't measure or explain. As the nurse left, Richard's mind drifted back through the years. He realized with a sharp pang of guilt that he hadn't really listened to Sophie in a long time. She used to love bedtime stories, fairy tales about brave princesses and guardian angels, myths about impossible miracles and the power of faith. Back when Sarah was alive, they'd taken turns reading to her every night. But after Sarah died, Richard had buried those stories along with his wife. He'd replaced bedtime with longer hours at the office, replaced fairy tales with the crushing silence of his executive suite. Sophie had asked for the stories a few times, but Richard had given her an iPad instead. She'd gotten quieter after that. Stopped asking. Tyler had forced him to remember all of it. At exactly 9 a.m., the door burst open and Dr. Morrison strode in, a security guard at her side. Her face was a mask of cold, professional anger. "Mr. Harrington," she said sharply, "I just reviewed the night shift reports." She held up her tablet like evidence in a trial. The monitors show an unexplained cardiac spike at 12:17 a.m., followed by documented motor function in the fingers. "Do you understand what that means?" Richard stood slowly, meeting her gaze. "It means she's fighting, doctor." "It means instability," Morrison snapped. "It means we need to run more tests." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "And the night nurse reported your incoherent mention of a barefoot boy. Tell me the truth, Mr. Harrington. Did you bring some street charlatan in here? Some unhygienic vagrant who might have introduced infection into my ICU?" The battle lines were drawn right there. The wealthy doctor with her degrees in technology versus the poor boy with his grandmother's wisdom. Science versus faith. Logic versus miracles. Richard felt something rise up in him. Not anger exactly, but conviction. "He is not a charlatan," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He spoke the truth. My daughter needed to hear the truth, and your machines couldn't give her that. Morrison's face flushed. This is an ICU, Mr. Harrington. It runs on facts, not folklore. Not superstition. Not desperate prayers from homeless children. She pointed a furious finger at the door. If you ever bring an unregistered, untrained person into this unit again, I will have the hospital board issue a court order to remove you from her bedside and place her under state medical care. Do you understand me? Richard's jaw locked. This woman was threatening to take away his last connection to his daughter, to tear his world apart while hiding behind protocols and procedures. You couldn't help her, doctor, he said quietly. Your science failed. That boy made her heart rate jump. You saw it in your precious data. A random neural discharge, Morrison said dismissively. It means nothing. She turned to the security guard. I want a full security sweep. Every camera reviewed. Find this Tyler, whoever he is. If he's found anywhere near this hospital, he's to be treated as a security threat. Then she looked back at Richard, her voice dripping with contempt. And stop your desperate prayers, Mr. Harrington. They're disturbing the other patients. She swept out of the room, the guard following, leaving Richard alone with the steady beep of the monitors. He waited until their footsteps faded, then slowly sank to his knees beside Sophie's bed. He didn't care if it looked weak. He didn't care if someone saw. God, he whispered, his voice cracking. If you're there, if you're still listening to a man who stopped listening to you years ago, please don't let this be it. Please. 2 hours later, Richard found himself in the hospital's security office, demanding to see the footage. The head of security, a tired-looking man named Mike Rodriguez, pulled up the recordings and started playing them back. There was Richard, entering room 512 at 11:54 p.m. There was Jennifer at her station. There was Richard stepping into the hallway at 12:03 a.m., talking to empty air. Mike frowned and rewound it. Played it again. The footage showed Richard clearly, gesturing, speaking, his mouth moving. It showed him nodding, as if listening to someone. It showed him walking back into room 512 with the door held open for no one. Inside the room, the camera showed Richard standing near Sophie's bed, his lips moving as if in conversation. It showed him breaking down, crying, confessing. It showed his hands clasped as if holding someone else's hand, but there was only empty space. And most impossibly, the footage showed the exact moment the heart monitor spiked. 12:17 a.m., just like the report said, right when Richard was speaking to nothing. The cameras are working perfectly, Mike said, checking the equipment logs. No glitches. No technical issues. They caught everything else, the nurses, the other visitors, even a janitor at the end of the hall. He looked at Richard with barely concealed confusion. But there's no boy, Mr. Harrington. No child at all. Richard stared at the screen, watching himself interact with someone who, according to the cameras, didn't exist. Someone who'd made Sophie's heart rate spike. Someone who'd made her fingers move for the first time in 9 days. Jennifer appeared in the doorway of the security office. I saw him, she said quietly but firmly. I spoke to him. He was real. Mike just shook his head, baffled. Richard walked back to room 512 in a daze, his mind spinning. Was Tyler human? An angel? Some kind of miracle that cameras couldn't capture? He didn't know. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever Tyler was, he'd touched something in that room that science couldn't reach. And he'd promised to come back. Richard sat down beside Sophie's bed and waited, holding her hand, praying for the impossible. By the afternoon of day 10, Richard Harrington had become that patient's father, the one the nurses whispered about, the one they avoided eye contact with, the one who'd had the breakdown. He could hear them talking in the hallway. Emotional interference, they said, using Dr. Morrison's clinical language. Morrison had filed an official report, painting Richard as unstable, delusional, a man so desperate he'd allowed a homeless child into the ICU based on nothing but false hope. Richard sat alone in room 512, staring at Sophie's face. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. Nothing had changed since Tyler left, except everything had changed. Those finger movements, that heart rate spike, the feeling that his daughter was still in there somewhere, listening. He thought about his life before all this, before the wealth, before the tragedy, Back when he was just a kid from a working-class family in Ohio, being raised by a grandmother who believed in angels and miracles and divine intervention. She used to tell him stories about impossible things, about people who came back from the brink, about prayers that were answered in mysterious ways, about faith that moved mountains. When he'd gotten into MIT on a full scholarship, Richard had dismissed all of it. He'd become rational, logical, scientific. He'd built an empire on algorithms and data, mocking anyone who believed in things that couldn't be measured, including Sarah. Sarah, his wife, who'd believed in all the things his grandmother had taught him. Sarah, who'd read Sophie fairy tales about guardian angels every night. Sarah, who'd asked him, near the end, to keep telling Sophie those stories, to keep her faith alive. And Richard had failed. After Sarah died, he'd shut down every conversation Sophie tried to have about heaven, about angels, about where mommy went. He'd given her iPads and expensive toys instead of comfort, instead of truth. The guilt was crushing him now, sitting on his chest like a physical weight. The door opened, and afternoon light streamed in. Richard assumed it was another nurse and didn't bother looking up. "I said I'd come back." Richard's head snapped around. Tyler stood in the doorway. Same worn clothes, same bare feet, same impossibly wise eyes. Richard nearly ran to him. "How did you get in?" "Security is looking for you. Dr. Morrison put out an alert." "I go where I'm needed," Tyler said simply. The answer should have frustrated Richard, but somehow it didn't. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Really?" Tyler's eyes met his, and Richard felt like he was looking into something ancient. "I'm someone who remembers what others forget." Without waiting for permission, Tyler walked to Sophie's bed and placed his hand gently on her wrist. He closed his eyes, and that same peaceful expression crossed his face. After a moment, he smiled, a real smile, the first Richard had seen from him. "She's closer today," Tyler said. Richard's heart leaped into his throat. "Closer. She's been listening. Your voice reached her yesterday. Your truth." Tyler opened his eyes and looked at Richard. "But now she needs something else." "Tell me," Richard said desperately. "Anything." Tyler's gaze seemed to see right through him. "She needs the song." Richard's face went blank with confusion. "Song? What song?" "The one you used to sing to her before," Tyler said softly. "Before the quiet." Richard stumbled backward like he'd been physically struck. There was only one song like that. Sarah's lullaby. The one they'd sung together every night, harmonizing while Sophie drifted off to sleep. The one Richard hadn't been able to sing since the day they buried Sarah 3 years ago. I can't," he whispered, his throat tightening painfully. Tyler's expression was gentle but firm. "Yes, you can, because she still remembers it. And so do you." Richard sank into the chair beside Sophie's bed, his hands trembling. He cleared his throat once, twice. Tears were already flowing down his face. "Starlight, star bright," he began, his voice cracking on every word. "Guide my angel through the night." He paused, choking on the memories flooding back. Tyler nodded encouragingly. Richard took a shaky breath and continued, his voice growing stronger. "Hold her close and keep her warm, till I see her in the dawn. Dreams of wonder, dreams of light, my Sophie dancing in the night." The heart monitor suddenly let out a long beep. Richard's eyes flew to it in panic, but then he saw what was happening. Her heart rate was rising. Not dangerously, not erratically, but steadily, purposefully climbing. Sophie's fingers twitched. Once, twice, 3 times. A new nurse, one Richard hadn't seen before, stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth. She rushed to the monitor, scribbling frantically on her chart. "She's reacting," she whispered in disbelief. "She's reacting to the music. This is impossible." Tyler looked at Richard with those knowing eyes. "You gave her something to come back to," he said. "Now she knows the way." Richard wiped his eyes, his voice raw and shaking. "Why are you helping us? You don't know us." Tyler stepped away from the bedside, and for a moment he looked less like a mystical healer and more like what he really was, a sad, lonely 10-year-old boy. "You're wrong," Tyler said quietly. "I do know her. Not her name, but her heart." He looked around the expensive room with all its technology. "Because I was a child once who cried in a bed just like this. I was alone and scared. No one ever came for me. No one sang. No one held my hand. I waited and waited, but no one ever told me to come home. Richard felt his legs go weak. The fundamental fear of every child, being left alone in the dark with no one to answer. Tyler's voice cracked. I promised myself that if I ever got the chance to change that for someone else, I would. Richard fell to his knees on the cold hospital floor. You're like an angel. Tyler didn't confirm or deny it. He just turned back to Sophie, placed his hand gently on her blanket, and whispered one last thing. A command, a blessing, a promise. You've been found. Then he walked toward the door. Wait, Richard called desperately. Will you come again tomorrow? Tyler turned, just a shape in the dim light. If she needs me, yes. But I think your voice is stronger now. Wait. Richard scrambled to his feet and ran into the hallway. But Tyler was gone. Vanished. Completely. A security guard stood posted down the hall, the one Morrison had stationed there. He was rigid, back turned, staring at his phone. He hadn't seen or heard anything. Richard stood in that empty hallway, his heart pounding, Sarah's lullaby still echoing in his mind. Behind him, in room 512, the monitors blinked with a new rhythm. The rhythm of a girl finding her way home. Dawn broke over Massachusetts General Hospital on day 11, and the ICU floor was alive with quiet panic. Doctors and nurses moved like whispers, their eyes wide with confusion. Something impossible was happening in room 512, and nobody could explain it. The cold, sterile hospital feeling that had dominated the room for so long was gone. In its place was something warmer. Something that felt almost like hope. Richard's voice was raw, barely more than a rasp. He'd been singing the lullaby over and over since Tyler left. Starlight, star bright, guide my angel through the night, until his throat burned and his voice cracked on every word. But he wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. He was kept alive by Tyler's promise, by the rhythm of Sophie's improving vitals, by the impossible belief that his voice could bring her home. Doctors had been streaming in and out all night, reviewing Sophie's charts with expressions of complete bewilderment. Her brain waves had stabilized. Her heart was strong and steady. There was no medical explanation, no drug, no treatment, no intervention that could account for what they were seeing. This doesn't make sense, one neurologist kept muttering, flipping through the data. None of this makes sense. Then, at exactly 6:02 a.m., it happened. Sophie's right hand, limp and unresponsive for 10 days, moved. Not a reflex. Not a test response. Real, purposeful movement. Her fingers stretched out slowly, deliberately, and wrapped around Richard's hand. She grabbed him. Richard crumbled. He collapsed forward, sobbing into her blanket, his entire body shaking. Something science couldn't explain had just happened. Something Dr. Morrison's machines and protocols couldn't touch. And in that moment, Richard didn't care about logic or data or any of it. He only cared about the faith Tyler had given him back. Thank you, he whispered through his tears. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Dr. Morrison arrived 30 minutes later, standing by the window with Sophie's chart in her hands. She'd reviewed it 5 times already, her expression cycling between fury and confusion. We don't understand this, she finally said to the head nurse. Her voice was tight, controlled, but Richard could hear the frustration beneath it. Neurologically, nothing explains this recovery. She's improving on her own. Without medication. Without intervention. Without anything we did. The head nurse glanced at Richard, then back at Morrison. What do we write in the chart, doctor? Morrison hesitated. Her entire reputation was built on being able to explain things, on understanding the mechanisms of the brain. This case made her look like she didn't know what she was doing. Anomaly, she finally whispered. Call it a spontaneous recovery anomaly. Richard smiled from his chair, still holding Sophie's hand. You call it what you want, doctor. I know what I saw. Morrison's head snapped toward him, her eyebrow raised. You think it's the boy, the vagrant who no one can find, who doesn't appear on any security footage? Richard nodded slowly, meeting her glare with calm certainty. I don't just think it. I know it. Morrison's anger finally snapped. You're putting your daughter's life at risk with this superstitious nonsense. You're an intelligent man, Mr. Harrington. Are you really going to sacrifice her health for some street fantasy? I'm filing a formal report with the board. Richard stood up, and the cold authority of the billionaire returned. But this time it was backed by something deeper than money. It was backed by love. "You will file nothing," he said quietly. "My daughter is recovering against all your predictions, doctor. Against all your science." Morrison started to protest, but Richard cut her off. "You want to remove me from her bedside? Fine. Try it. But you will write this in her chart. Recovery due to emotional reconnection and paternal presence. Because that's the truth." Dr. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then turned away, beaten by a truth she couldn't measure or explain. That afternoon, Richard stepped outside for the first time in days. The Boston air was crisp and clean, and he felt lighter than he had in years. He walked to a nearby bookstore and bought a leather journal, one he could fill with songs, stories, prayers. A promise to himself that he would never let silence be his language again. When he returned to the hospital, he found something taped to Sophie's window. A small folded note in crooked handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened it. "Sometimes the healing comes before the waking. She hears you. Keep singing. T." Richard pressed the paper to his heart. Tyler had come back. He was still watching over them. Throughout the day, Sophie's changes became more pronounced. Her breathing deepened, sounding less like a machine and more like a person. Color returned to her cheeks. Her fingers moved more frequently. Her eyelids fluttered, as if she was dreaming. Late that night, Richard sat in his chair reading from his new journal, writing stories for Sophie about brave girls and starlight and love that never gives up. His voice was hoarse but steady as he read aloud. Then he heard it, a whisper so soft he thought he'd imagined it. "Daddy." The journal slipped from his hands. His legs went weak. He rushed to the bedside, his heart hammering. "Sophie. Sophie, can you hear me, baby?" Her eyes opened, just slightly, just enough. She blinked slowly, her lips barely moving. "You came back," she whispered. Richard was choking on tears. "I never left. I never left you, baby. I'm right here." A single tear rolled down Sophie's cheek. "Where's the boy?" Richard froze. You saw him?" Sophie nodded very slowly. "He said he was the echo that found me when I was floating." "Floating?" Richard breathed. "I couldn't see anything," Sophie whispered, her voice faint but clear. "Just darkness. I was so scared, Daddy. But then someone sang. He sang until I heard your voice again." She closed her eyes, gathering strength. He held my hand. Richard's tears fell freely now. "What did he say, sweetheart?" "He said, 'Your daddy's waiting on the other side of the dark.'" Sophie's lips curved into the tiniest smile. "And I followed the light. He led me back." "He led you back," Richard repeated, his voice breaking. Sophie's smile grew a little stronger, a tiny ghost of her old smile. "He smelled like outside. And old books." She opened her eyes again, looking at her father. His name was Tyler. Richard didn't know how to respond. "Sweetheart, Tyler is." He couldn't finish. A messenger? A miracle? An angel sent by forces he'd stopped believing in years ago? Sophie finished the thought for him, her words soft but certain. "He said he didn't need wings to fly. Just faith." Then she drifted back to sleep. But it wasn't the empty silence of a coma. It was real sleep, peaceful, natural healing. Richard sat back in his chair, still holding her hand, and wept. Not from grief this time, but from gratitude, from wonder, from the overwhelming knowledge that his daughter had been lost in darkness, and a homeless boy with no shoes and infinite wisdom had brought her home. Outside the window, Boston sparkled with lights. Somewhere in those streets, Tyler was walking, still helping, still healing, still remembering what others had forgotten. And Sophie was sleeping. Really, truly sleeping. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, but now it sounded less like a warning and more like a lullaby. By the morning of day 12, Massachusetts General Hospital was in complete uproar. Sophie Harrington's chart made absolutely no sense. No drugs had worked. No treatments had taken effect. By every measure of modern medicine, she shouldn't have woken up. But she had. In a cramped security office on the third floor, a young intern named Marcus Webb sat hunched over a monitor, obsessed. He'd been scrolling through the security footage for what felt like the 100th time, rewinding, fast-forwarding, zooming in on every frame. The cameras had captured everything else: nurses making rounds, janitors mopping floors, Dr. Morrison's angry visits. Everything except the one thing that mattered. The hallway where Tyler should have been was empty. Always empty. Marcus leaned back in his chair, goosebumps crawling up his arms. He whispered to the empty room. That boy was never on camera. He was never here. He paused, his voice dropping to barely audible. But he was here. The footage showed Richard Harrington clearly, talking to empty air, gesturing as if listening to someone, holding the door open for no one. It showed him breaking down, confessing to shadows. And impossibly, the timestamps proved that Sophie's vitals had spiked at the exact moments Richard was interacting with. Nothing. Marcus questioned his own sanity and checked the equipment logs again. Everything was functioning perfectly. The cameras simply hadn't captured Tyler. Couldn't capture him. Inside room 512, it was a different world entirely. Sophie sat propped up against pillows, holding her father's hand while they watched a cartoon together. She had color in her cheeks now, though she was still sleepy and weak. But she was back. Really back. "Tell me the story again," Sophie said with a small yawn. Richard smiled. "What story, sweetheart?" "The girl who danced with the moonlight." Richard's heart stopped. He hadn't told that story, that specific story, since before Sarah died. It had been Sarah's favorite, one she'd made up herself. How could Sophie possibly remember? Then it hit him. Tyler had told her. Richard's voice was strong now, not broken, as he began the tale. "Once upon a time, there was a girl who could hear the stars singing. She danced on clouds and collected moonbeams in her pockets." "Tyler told me that one," Sophie interrupted softly. "When I was in the dark place. He said it was Mommy's favorite." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "It was baby. It was." Meanwhile, in the hospital's administrative wing, an emergency board meeting had been called. Dr. Morrison stood at the head of the conference table, presenting Sophie's case to a room full of confused and skeptical board members. The word spontaneous recovery sounded like a cover-up, and everyone knew it. All protocols were followed, Morrison said firmly, clicking through slides of data. All interventions were attempted according to standard procedure. The recovery is unprecedented. She refused to mention Tyler or any emotional factors. To do so would be professional suicide. But the board members exchanged glances. They'd heard the rumors. About the homeless boy. About the father's breakdown. About security footage that showed impossible things. That night, Richard sat in the chair beside Sophie's bed, filling page after page of his new leather journal. He wrote stories about Sarah, memories he'd buried for 3 years. Tales of faith and miracles. Songs he'd thought he'd forgotten. At the top of the first page, he'd written in bold letters, "I will never let silence win again. I will tell her stories every day. I will remember what Tyler taught me." Just before midnight, Richard stepped into the hallway for air. Sophie was sleeping peacefully, and he needed to stretch his legs. The wing was empty, lights dimmed for the night shift. Then he heard it, soft, familiar, unmistakable. "You did good, Mr. Harrington." Richard spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. There Tyler stood, barefoot, same dusty clothes, same impossibly wise eyes. But this time he was smiling, wide and bright and real. "Tyler," Richard breathed, tears instantly filling his eyes. The boy nodded. "She doesn't need me anymore." "She asked for you," Richard said. "I know," Tyler replied gently. "But now she has you. That's better." Richard's heart felt full enough to burst. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope of cash. More money than Tyler had probably ever seen in his life. Enough for school, for clothes, for a real future. "What do I owe you?" Richard asked, his voice shaking. "You saved my daughter. Take this. Take enough for school, for everything you need." Tyler looked down at the money, then back up at Richard. His smile softened into something ancient and knowing. "Keep your money, Mr. Harrington." Richard was bewildered. "But your future, your needs." "The future is built on what you remember," Tyler said quietly, "not what you buy." His gaze fixed on the leather journal in Richard's other hand. "Tell her stories every night, even when she's grown. Never stop singing. That is the payment for the old way." Richard's eyes blurred as understanding washed over him. The boy's mission had never been about wealth or reward. It was about truth, memory, love, the things that couldn't be bought or measured or explained. Will I ever see you again? Richard asked, his voice breaking. Tyler paused. Maybe. Then softer. Or maybe someone else will. When they need reminding about what really matters. He turned and walked toward the end of the hallway. Richard watched, not chasing this time, understanding that some things had to be let go. No door opened. No sound echoed. Tyler just faded. Gone like morning mist, like a dream dissolving at dawn. Richard stood there, tears streaming down his face, full of both sorrow and overwhelming faith. He no longer questioned the impossible. He simply accepted the miracle. Tyler had been exactly what Sophie needed. What they both needed. When Richard returned to room 512, Sophie's eyes were open. Was that Tyler? She asked softly. Richard nodded, sitting beside her. Yes, baby. He came to say goodbye. Sophie smiled, a real smile, the kind he hadn't seen in so long. He said he would. He said you'd remember how to sing now. Richard took her hand and began humming the lullaby softly. Outside the window, Boston glowed with a million lights. Somewhere in those streets, a homeless boy was walking, carrying his grandmother's harmonica, looking for the next lost soul who needed to find their way home. And in room 512, a father and daughter held hands and sang together, finally understanding that the greatest miracles aren't the ones science can explain. They're the ones love makes possible. 3 months had passed since Sophie Harrington opened her eyes. 3 months since a miracle walked barefoot through Massachusetts General Hospital and changed everything. Sophie was fully recovered now, back home in their Beacon Hill townhouse, running and laughing like the collapse had never happened. The medical mystery that had stumped every specialist remained unsolved. And Richard hadn't stopped telling the story, not to prove anything, but because some truths were too important to keep quiet. The hospital, led by Dr. Morrison, had its official story. They called it spontaneous neural reintegration. Fancy words dancing around a truth they couldn't accept. Morrison had filed a scathing report accusing Richard of reckless endangerment, but it hadn't mattered. The truth was standing right there, a happy, healthy 9-year-old girl who shouldn't have survived. Science had been humbled by a song. Faith had defeated technology. Love had conquered logic. Richard Harrington, the man who'd built an empire of circuits and algorithms, was building something different now. He'd sold his Range Rover first, then the vacation homes in Martha's Vineyard and Aspen. He was downsizing Harrington Technologies, promoting his COO to run the company while he focused on what really mattered. He used the money to launch a program called Voices at Dawn, a free art and music center for children in underserved communities. It was specifically for kids dealing with trauma and grief, the ones who'd lost their voices to pain. And he'd placed it in Roxbury, in Tyler's neighborhood, where help was needed most. The grand opening was nothing corporate or flashy. Just a warm, welcoming space filled with instruments and art supplies, with a storytelling corner piled high with pillows and books. Above the entrance, a simple wooden sign proclaimed, "Where silence ends and healing begins." It was Richard's reminder of Tyler's lesson, of what he'd almost lost, of what really mattered. Sophie volunteered at the center every day after school. She'd teach younger kids songs, including the lullaby that had brought her back. She'd tell them stories about guardian angels and impossible miracles. And sometimes, when they asked how she knew these things, she'd tell them about the boy who saved her life. Richard had tried to find Tyler. He'd visited every shelter in Boston, asking about a homeless boy with a harmonica, about a folk healer grandmother named Grace. But there were no records, no traces. It was as if Tyler had never existed at all. Was he real? An angel? A ghost? The security cameras had never caught him. There were no footprints, no physical evidence. But Sophie remembered him. So did Richard. And Jennifer, the night nurse, still swore she'd spoken to him. At the center's entrance, Richard had placed a small memorial plaque. In honor of Tyler Johnson, who taught us that the greatest healing comes not from science, but from love. Fresh flowers always sat beneath it. Richard brought new ones every week. Sophie still sang the lullaby every night before bed. Richard would join her, harmonizing like he used to do with Sarah. The song was kept alive. There would never be silence again. Richard's journals had multiplied, now 3 volumes filled with stories, songs, and memories. Sophie read them constantly, and had started adding her own stories. They were building a legacy together, one tale at a time. Richard's life had transformed completely. He spent less time in the office and more time with Sophie. They had weekly stargazing sessions, bedtime stories every single night. He was present for breakfast, for homework, for the mundane, beautiful moments he'd missed for so long. He'd become the father he should have been all along. Dr. Morrison eventually left Massachusetts General. Her reputation had been damaged by the Harrington case, the one that made her look like she didn't have all the answers. She'd gone to work for a pharmaceutical company, still chasing explanations in data and molecules. She still didn't believe in miracles. But the doubt haunted her late at night when she was alone. The ripple effect of Sophie's story spread quietly. Other families who heard about it started talking to their comatose loved ones, singing to them, telling them stories, sharing truth. Some woke up. Some didn't. But all of them received the love they deserved in their final or finest hours. News outlets had wanted the story, but Richard refused most interviews. He protected Sophie's privacy fiercely. But he let the story spread organically, word of mouth, faith to faith, heart to heart. On the 1-year anniversary of Sophie's collapse, Richard and Sophie stood together at the center. The room was full of children laughing, creating healing. Music and art and stories flowed like water. Sophie stood on a small stage and addressed the assembled kids, her voice clear and strong. "A year ago, I was lost in darkness," she said. "A boy I never met found me there. He taught my dad how to bring me home." She paused, looking at Richard. "He taught us that love is louder than machines. That stories matter more than screens. That being there matters more than being rich. And that angels don't always have wings." The children listened, wide-eyed, believing every word. After her speech, Sophie held something up, an old, worn harmonica. She'd found it on the center's doorstep on opening day, with no note and no explanation. Just Tyler's harmonica, left as a gift or a promise. Sophie had learned to play it from online videos. Simple melodies, nothing fancy. But when she played, she swore she felt someone listening, someone encouraging her from far away. Richard stood at the center's window, watching Sophie teach a small boy how to hold the harmonica properly. He remembered the desperate father he'd been in that hospital room, the man who'd valued code over connection, success over presence. He'd come so close to losing everything that mattered. Tyler had saved Sophie's life, but he'd saved Richard's soul. He'd taught him what really mattered. Not wealth or success or innovation, but presence and truth and love. Late that afternoon, as the center was closing, a young woman entered. She looked hesitant, hopeful, desperate. "Is this the place with the sign?" she asked. "About healing and silence." Richard nodded, recognizing the look in her eyes. He'd worn it himself once. "My daughter's been in a coma for 3 weeks, she said, tears streaming down her face. "The doctors are losing hope. I heard about your daughter's miracle. I came looking for, I don't know, answers." Richard didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what to do. He sat with her and shared Tyler's lesson. "Tell her the truth of your heart," he said gently. "Sing the songs she loves. Be present in your pain. Don't hide behind strength or fear." He pulled out a copy of his journal, he kept several on hand now, and gave it to her. "This is what saved us. Not money, not medicine, just love made audible." The woman left with hope in her eyes, clutching the journal like a lifeline. Richard watched her go, knowing that Tyler's work continued. Through him, through Sophie, through everyone they touched. The miracle was multiplying, spreading like light through darkness. That evening, Richard and Sophie drove home through Boston's glowing streets. The skyline sparkled with a million lights. "Do you think Tyler's real?" Sophie asked suddenly. Richard thought for a moment, then smiled. "I think he's as real as we need him to be. Real enough to save your life. Real enough to change mine. Real enough to teach us how to love." Sophie nodded, satisfied with that answer. As they drove, they passed a homeless person on a corner. Richard stopped, rolled down his window, and handed them money, a blanket, and one of the center's cards. "In case you know someone who needs healing," he said. The person looked up, and Richard caught a glimpse of their eyes, deep, clear, impossibly wise. Familiar somehow. They nodded slowly. "I know exactly who needs this." Richard drove away, his heart full. Was it Tyler? Another angel? Someone Tyler had sent. Did it even matter? The work continued. The healing spread. That was what counted. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Richard sat in his study and wrote in his current journal. Tyler taught me that miracles aren't about proof. They're about faith. And faith begins when we choose to believe. He looked out the window at Boston's sleeping streets and wrote one more thing. Somewhere in Boston tonight, a homeless boy with a harmonica walks into another hospital, ready to speak 5 impossible words to another desperate father. Because the healing never stops, as long as someone remembers to sing, to tell the truth, to love. In Sophie's room, moonlight streamed through the window and fell across her nightstand. Tyler's harmonica sat there, catching the light. For just a moment, it seemed to glow, not brightly, just a soft pulse of warmth. Or maybe that was just the moonlight playing tricks. Or maybe it wasn't. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, someone was humming a lullaby. The end.
If this story moved you, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And don't stop here, tap the next story on your screen. I promise, it's just as powerful and filled with the same kind of hope, wonder, and unexpected twist. You don't want to miss it. See you in the next story.